This is the story of a woman who discovers betrayal after 20 years of marriage. What will she do now? Will she find the strength to move on? Or will she stay and try to rebuild? Watch till the end to find out. Like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional journeys like this. Maggie had built a life she was proud of, filled with moments of quiet joy and contentment. At 60, she still felt the gentle weight of her years in her bones, the rhythm of life steady and familiar. For 20 years, she and Paul had shared a marriage that, at least to the outside world, seemed unshakable. They had raised 2 children, celebrated anniversaries, and navigated the mundane challenges of life together. She had always prided herself on the deep trust they had, believing their relationship was built on the solid foundation of love and mutual respect. But in recent months, something had shifted. Maggie couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started, but there was a subtle change in Paul. It wasn't glaring or obvious at first, just small things. He had become more withdrawn, often retreating to his study after dinner, rather than sitting with her in the living room. His phone, once left carelessly around the house, was now constantly by his side, screened down whenever she entered a room. When she asked him about his day, there was a new defensiveness in his tone, as though he resented the question. Maggie had brushed off these signs, chalking them up to stress from work or the pressures of life. They had been married for so long, surely the foundation of their bond would hold up to a few rough patches. But there were moments, glances exchanged with his phone, the hurried way he would hide it when she walked by, his lateness in returning home from work. That gave Maggie a sick feeling in her stomach. It was subtle, yet persistent, like a grain of sand stuck in the shoe, irritating and hard to ignore. One evening, after Paul had returned from a late dinner meeting, Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table when she noticed something strange. A message notification on his phone, briefly flashing on the screen. It wasn't the first time she had seen him leave his phone unattended, but this time, something felt different. Without thinking, she reached over and swiped the screen. There, staring back at her, was a name she didn't recognize. Emily. Her heart skipped a beat, and in that moment, a wave of confusion and unease washed over her. Who was Emily? A colleague? A friend? Maggie had no way of knowing for sure, but the simple fact that Paul's phone had been so carefully guarded from her gaze suggested that something wasn't right. As she read the message, a pit formed in her stomach. It was a simple text, just a few words, but it carried a weight Maggie couldn't ignore. Can't wait to see you tonight. Her mind raced, spinning with questions. Who was this woman? Was there something more between them? It was the first real sign that the world she thought she knew might not be what it appeared. Maggie felt a rising panic, but she pushed it down, telling herself it was just a misunderstanding. After all, Paul had always been affectionate, always attentive. Could she really believe her own eyes? Could it be that after 20 years of marriage, the man she had given her heart to could betray her like this? As she set the phone down and returned to her seat, Maggie's mind raced. She didn't want to jump to conclusions. She needed to know the truth, to have something concrete before confronting Paul. The unease lingered, but she fought the urge to act on impulse. This wasn't something that could be undone. If she opened this door, there would be no going back. The next day, as Paul left for work, Maggie felt a strange sense of resignation settle over her. She had no answers, only questions. The clues were there, but they were only fragments. Pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she was ready to solve, but a part of her knew she had to. The life they had built together was shifting beneath her, and she had to face whatever was waiting on the other side. The days following that discovery felt like an endless blur for Maggie. She couldn't shake the image of that text message. Can't wait to see you tonight. She tried to go about her daily routine, but every time Paul left for work or went into another room, her mind returned to the question she could no longer ignore. Who was Emily? And why was Paul keeping this from her? Maggie spent hours in her own thoughts, weighing the consequences of confronting Paul. She knew she couldn't go on living in a world of doubt, but she didn't want to destroy everything without understanding the full truth. What if it was just a misunderstanding? What if Emily was just a friend or a colleague? Maybe it was something innocent, a harmless flirtation, not the betrayal she feared. But the more she thought about it, the more the evidence stacked up. Paul's secrecy, his strange behavior, the guarded phone, it was all leading to one painful conclusion. He was hiding something from her, and that something she feared was far worse than she had imagined. One afternoon, the breaking point came when Maggie decided to follow Paul. She hadn't planned on doing it, but the urge to know the truth was overwhelming. After he left the house, she followed him from a safe distance, her heart pounding in her chest. For the longest time, he didn't seem to notice her. He drove in the direction of the office, but then he veered off, heading towards a part of town Maggie didn't recognize. He parked the car outside a cafe, one she had never heard of, and entered. Maggie sat in her car, staring at the cafe. She didn't want to be here, didn't want to face whatever was about to happen, but the decision had already been made. She knew she couldn't go on like this, living in this perpetual state of uncertainty. If she was going to have peace, she needed answers. Minutes later, her heart sank when a woman, slender, with dark hair, walked out of the cafe and met Paul by the door. They hugged and Maggie could see them laughing together. The woman leaned in close, touching Paul's arm in a way that made Maggie's stomach churn. The intimate connection between them was undeniable. Her worst fears had come to life. Maggie's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had known it in her gut, but seeing it with her own eyes left her numb. This wasn't just a fling or a moment of weakness. This was a betrayal that cut to the core. Maggie didn't wait to see more. She started the car and drove home, the weight of what she had seen bearing down on her with each passing mile. When she arrived back at the house, Maggie sat in the driveway for several long minutes, her mind a whirlwind of emotion. She had to confront Paul. It couldn't wait any longer. Later that evening, when Paul arrived home, Maggie stood in the kitchen pretending to prepare dinner. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say, but the decision had already been made. She couldn't continue pretending everything was fine. Paul walked in, offering a casual greeting, but the tension between them was palpable. He paused when he saw the look on Maggie's face. Her eyes were steady, unwavering. He knew something was different, but he couldn't quite place it. "Maggie, what's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Maggie didn't answer immediately. She walked over to the counter, picked up his phone, and placed it in front of him. The phone was still warm from his pocket. "Who is Emily?" she asked quietly, her voice controlled. But the hurt was there, underneath, like a shadow creeping up. Paul froze. His eyes widened and, for a moment, he said nothing. Maggie could see the guilt flash across his face before he masked it with a defensive expression. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "I'm talking about the message on your phone," Maggie replied, her voice steady but with an edge of disbelief. "The one that says, 'Can't wait to see you tonight.' I saw it, Paul. And I saw you today with her." Paul's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing, as though he were struggling for words. "Maggie, it's not what you think," he finally said, his voice rising slightly. "You're jumping to conclusions." Maggie's heart pounded as the reality of his words sank in. "I'm not jumping to conclusions. I know what I saw. I followed you, Paul. I saw you with her. The way she touched you. The way you looked at her." Her voice cracked at the end, but she didn't look away. "Tell me the truth. Do you love her?" There was a long silence, and then Paul let out a shaky breath. He lowered his head, as if trying to find a way to explain the unexplainable. "Maggie, please. It's complicated," he said, his voice quieter now, pleading. "I never wanted to hurt you. It's not like that." But Maggie wasn't listening. The words she had been afraid of hearing were now fully exposed, and there was no going back. She had always believed in the integrity of their bond, but now the truth was undeniable, and it was eating away at everything she had ever known. "I don't want your excuses, Paul," she said firmly, stepping away from him. "I want the truth. And right now the truth is that you've betrayed me, and I don't know how to fix that." As she spoke, Maggie's chest tightened with the enormity of what she was saying. It was over. There was no fixing this. The person she had trusted with her heart, her life, had broken that trust beyond repair. And now it was up to her to decide what came next. Paul stood there, his eyes searching her face, but there was nothing left to say. Maggie turned away, retreating to the bedroom, where she would sit in silence. alone with the devastating truth of what had just happened. The silence that followed the confrontation settled over Maggie like a thick, oppressive fog. She hadn't expected an apology. After all, the truth had been laid bare. But what she hadn't anticipated was the depth of the emotional pain that came with it. For the first time in their 20 years of marriage, she didn't recognize Paul. He was a stranger now, someone who had shattered the trust she had once so freely given. The man she thought she knew, the one she had built a life with, was now someone she could barely look at without feeling an overwhelming wave of grief and anger. Maggie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. Her mind raced through a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more painful than the last. How could he have done this? How long had it been going on? Were there more women? The questions seemed endless, but none of them provided her with any answers. She had spent so many years loving Paul, raising their children, supporting him through every challenge. And yet in a few moments, that love felt like it had been trampled, reduced to nothing but a hollow memory. The emotional weight of the betrayal felt suffocating. She could feel it pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, as if the very foundation of her life had been yanked out from under her. Her mind flicked to the first signs, the way Paul had become distant, secretive, and defensive. She had ignored them, brushed them off as nothing more than the usual stresses of life. But now, in the wake of the truth, everything she had ignored came rushing back with painful clarity. It was as if the world she had known was suddenly distorted, like a broken mirror where the reflection no longer resembled the truth. The tears came then, not in torrents, but in quiet, heavy sobs. They weren't tears of surprise or shock. She had known something was wrong for a long time. These were tears of loss. She had invested so much of herself in this marriage, and now she was left with the wreckage of what remained. But even in the midst of her grief, a flicker of resolve began to rise in her. Maggie had always been a strong woman. She had weathered life's challenges with grace and determination. And though this betrayal felt like a cruel blow, she knew she couldn't stay in this place forever. She had to move forward. But how? And where? Maggie's thoughts shifted to her children, her daughter in particular, who had just started her first year of college. What would this mean for them? How would they see their father? The thought of their daughter's heartbreak made Maggie's chest ache even more. She had always worked hard to protect her family, to keep them whole, to maintain the sense of unity that had defined their home. Now it felt like that was slipping away from her, beyond her control. But Maggie wasn't a passive victim. She couldn't just sit back and allow herself to be swallowed by the pain. She had to take control. She had to reclaim her life, for herself and for her children. The night stretched on, and Paul made no attempt to follow her into the bedroom. He had retreated to the living room, giving her space. But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that he was simply waiting for everything to blow over. He wasn't sorry, not truly, not in the way she needed him to be. His words, his apologies, felt empty, meaningless in the face of what he had done. He could beg for forgiveness all he wanted, but it wouldn't change the truth. The truth was that she had been betrayed in a way that couldn't be undone with promises or remorse. At one point, she heard him pacing in the living room. His movements were frantic, hurried, as if he were trying to escape the weight of what had happened. She knew he was struggling, but Maggie couldn't bring herself to care anymore. She didn't owe him her comfort, not after what he had done. The thought of comforting him, of reassuring him that everything would be okay, felt like a betrayal to herself. Eventually, Maggie's mind grew tired, and her thoughts began to slow. She still wasn't ready to confront Paul again. She needed time. Time to process the betrayal, time to figure out what she wanted. But there was one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't live in this limbo. The uncertainty was eating away at her, and she had to make a decision, whether to confront him again or to take more drastic action. She couldn't wait forever. As the hours passed, Maggie's resolve grew. This wasn't just about her marriage anymore. It was about her dignity, her sense of self-worth. It was about standing up for herself after years of being the supportive wife, the mother who had always put everyone else's needs first. She had spent so much time nurturing her family, and now it was time for her to care for herself. The decision wasn't clear yet, but she knew she was standing on the edge of something. She couldn't go back to the way things were. Whatever happened next, She would not let this betrayal define her. She would not be the woman who stayed in a broken marriage out of fear or obligation. Maggie was determined to reclaim her life, even if it meant walking away from everything she had known. As the night wore on, she finally fell into a fitful sleep, but the thoughts didn't stop. The pain of betrayal lingered in the edges of her dreams, but the ember of strength inside her refused to die out. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she would never let this break her. The following morning, the house felt colder than it ever had before. The silence between Maggie and Paul was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards as he moved through the house. Paul didn't come into the bedroom. He didn't try to speak to her over breakfast. It was as if the whole house had retreated into some limbo, the once familiar rhythms of daily life now thrown off balance. Maggie could sense Paul's unease. She could hear the muffled sound of him moving around in the living room, sighing deeply, pacing as if he were rehearsing something. He was trying to find the right words, she knew, but no words could undo what he had done. Nothing he could say would erase the hurt, the betrayal that had lodged itself deep in her chest. Finally, Paul approached the bedroom. He knocked gently on the door, though Maggie didn't answer. He opened it slowly, cautiously, as though afraid that the very act of speaking might cause everything to unravel further. "Maggie," his voice was soft, filled with an edge of desperation. "Can we talk?" Maggie didn't look up from the bed, her hands tightly gripping the quilt, her eyes fixed on the wall in front of her. She didn't want to look at him. She didn't want to hear what he had to say. But she knew, deep down, that the conversation had to happen. She couldn't move forward without it, no matter how much she dreaded it. "Talk?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's left to say, Paul?" He sighed a long, drawn-out exhale of breath and sat down beside her, just within arm's reach. Maggie could feel his presence beside her, but it did nothing to comfort her. If anything, it made her want to retreat further into herself, to shut him out completely. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be," he began, his voice shaky but trying to steady itself. "I've made a huge mistake, Maggie, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But I need you to know, this wasn't something I planned. I didn't mean for it to happen." Maggie looked at him then, her gaze hard, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" she repeated, incredulous. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Paul, you've been seeing this woman for months, maybe longer. How do you not plan for that?" Paul flinched, his face contorting with guilt. But he didn't deny it. Instead, he rubbed his hands over his face, trying to calm his shaking hands. "It just happened. It started out innocent enough, just casual conversations at work. But then, it grew into something more. I didn't know how to stop it, Maggie, and I kept telling myself it was just a phase, something that would blow over. But I didn't realize how far I had gone until it was too late." Maggie stood up, walking to the window, her back to him. The view outside, the same one she had looked at 1,000 times before, felt unfamiliar now. Everything felt wrong. "You didn't realize how far you had gone?" she said, her voice rising with frustration. "What do you think this is, Paul? A mistake? A phase? You're telling me that you've been having an affair with this woman, and you thought it was just something temporary? Just a little slip-up?" Paul stood up as well, stepping closer to her, though he didn't touch her. His voice softened, almost pleading. "Maggie, please. I never meant for it to get out of control. You have to understand, I was stressed with work, with everything going on in my life. I wasn't getting the attention I needed at home. I never meant for it to go this far. I swear to you, I never wanted to hurt you." Maggie felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat, but she forced it back down. She wanted to scream, to let her anger spill out and wash over him, to make him feel the depth of her pain. But instead she stood there, silently absorbing his words. "So this is my fault, is it?" she asked quietly, her back still to him. "Because you weren't getting enough attention at home? Because you were stressed? You decided to betray me? To throw away 20 years of our marriage?" "No, Maggie, it's not like that," Paul said, his voice cracking with the weight of guilt. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It's just, things weren't the same between us. I didn't know how to talk to you about it. I'm so sorry." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the first time he had said he was sorry, but this apology felt hollow. She didn't want his apologies anymore. They didn't matter. They couldn't take away the images she had seen, the hugs, the whispered words, the closeness he had shared with another woman. The pain of betrayal was sharp and raw, and no amount of remorse could heal it. "No," Maggie said softly, shaking her head. "I don't believe you. Not anymore. Not after everything I've seen." She turned to face him, her heart heavy with the weight of her words. "You don't get to explain this away with excuses. You don't get to diminish the hurt you've caused with your words. What you did, Paul, it's unforgivable." He opened his mouth to speak, but Maggie held up a hand, silencing him. "Don't. Just don't. I've heard enough. I don't need you to tell me how hard your life's been. I need you to face the reality of what you've done. And the reality is, you've broken something that can't be fixed." Paul stared at her for a long moment, his face filled with a mixture of shame and confusion. He was broken too, but in that moment, Maggie didn't care. The man who had once been her partner, her equal, had abandoned her. He had abandoned them. There was no more room for his justifications or explanations. "Just go, Paul," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "Just go. I don't want to hear any more." Paul's face crumpled, and for a moment, he seemed like the man she had once loved. But it was fleeting. He turned and left the room without another word, leaving Maggie standing there, her heart shattered and her resolve beginning to take root. As the door closed behind him, Maggie finally allowed herself to cry. It wasn't the tears of shock or confusion. These were the tears of a woman who had faced the harsh truth. The truth that her marriage, her life as she knew it, was over. And it was time to rebuild, no matter how painful that would be. The days following Paul's departure were a blur. Maggie spent the time in quiet reflection, each moment pulling her deeper into a space she had never wanted to enter. The house, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a shell. The life she had so carefully built seemed fragile, shattered like glass under the weight of Paul's betrayal. But with each passing day, she realized something more. She could no longer stand in this place of limbo. The decision had to be made. She hadn't spoken to Paul since the confrontation. He had left early that morning, muttering something about needing time to think. But Maggie had no interest in listening to his words anymore. His apologies, his explanations, all seemed hollow now. She knew that if she stayed in this marriage, nothing would ever be the same. The foundation of trust they had built had been irreparably cracked. For the first time in years, Maggie put herself first. She knew that in order to move forward, she had to let go of the past. And letting go meant making a decision. It was time for a divorce. Maggie spent the next few days in a haze, her mind constantly wrestling with the enormity of her choice. She felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders, the burden of ending a marriage that had lasted 2 decades. But beneath the weight, there was a sense of clarity. She was no longer the woman who would tolerate betrayal out of fear or obligation. She was no longer the wife who would put everyone else's needs before her own. The kids, particularly her daughter, who had just come home for a visit, were her biggest concern. Maggie hadn't told them yet, hadn't even begun to think about how she would explain the situation. How would they react? Would they blame her? Would they understand that this was not a choice she had made lightly? But deep down, Maggie knew that they would see the truth. Her children were no strangers to the complexities of relationships, and they were old enough to understand that sometimes things fell apart, no matter how hard you tried to hold them together. In the quiet moments, Maggie reflected on the future. She imagined a life for herself, a life where she wasn't constantly walking on eggshells, where she could find peace and happiness again. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't afraid of the work it would take to rebuild her life. She had spent so many years tending to everyone else, putting their needs before her own. Now it was time to put herself first, and that meant taking control of her own future. She contacted a divorce lawyer. The process wasn't glamorous or dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no public confrontations. It was just the quiet, steady march toward closure. She knew that a divorce was the only way to regain the life she had lost. The betrayal, the lies, and the secrets. None of them could be erased, but she could move forward. She didn't need Paul to be whole. She had been whole before he came into her life, and she would be whole again. As she sat in the lawyer's office, Maggie listened attentively, asking questions and making decisions with a calm determination. The lawyer, a woman named Sarah, was kind but efficient. She laid out the steps of the process, explaining how they would divide their assets, what would happen with the house, and how they would handle custody of the children. But it wasn't about the logistics for Maggie. It was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her peace of mind. She didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer afraid to face it. She had survived worse in her life, and she would survive this. No matter how painful the road ahead, it was better than living in the shadow of a marriage that had died long ago. That night, Maggie sat with her daughter Rachel and carefully explained what had happened. She chose her words carefully, not wanting to overwhelm Rachel with too much information, but knowing she couldn't keep the truth from her. Rachel, though devastated, was supportive. "Mom," she said quietly, "I don't want you to feel like you have to stay with him. You deserve so much more than that." And with those words, Maggie knew she had made the right choice. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was no longer alone in this. Her daughter, her family, and most importantly, herself, would be her strength as she faced the unknown. The decision had been made. There was no going back, no room for hesitation. Maggie had filed for divorce, and now it was time for the final confrontation with Paul. She hadn't seen him since the day he left, but he had been calling, sending messages, begging for another chance, asking if they could talk. He wasn't ready to let go, but Maggie was. She was done. She had spent the last week gathering her strength, preparing herself for this moment. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be tears, there would be anger, but most of all, there would be closure. She had spent far too long trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. It was time to take the final step. Maggie asked Paul to meet her at the house. She had already arranged for a mediator to be present. She wanted to make sure this conversation was civil, that there would be no more manipulations, no more justifications. She didn't want to hear how hard his life had been. She didn't want to hear about how it wasn't really his fault. Maggie had made up her mind, and she was no longer willing to accept his excuses. When Paul arrived, he looked weary, as though the weight of everything that had happened had finally caught up with him. He was still dressed in his work clothes, a button-down shirt and slacks, but he looked tired, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Maggie could see the shame in his face, but it didn't move her. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, was no longer the person standing before her. "I'm sorry, Maggie," Paul said softly as he sat down across from her. "I know I've hurt you, and I regret it every day, but we can fix this. We can work through it. Please, please don't go through with the divorce." Maggie looked at him for a long moment, her heart heavy but resolute. "It's too late, Paul," she said quietly. "You had your chances. I wanted to make this work. I really did. But you broke me, and I can't keep living in a lie." She paused, her voice steady. "The truth is, I don't love you the way I used to, and I can't keep pretending that I do. We've both changed, and maybe we didn't see it, but this is what it's come to." Paul's face twisted with emotion, a mix of confusion, anger, and desperation. "Maggie, please, I'll do whatever it takes. I can change. I'll prove to you that I'm sorry. Just give me one more chance." Maggie shook her head, her voice firm. "I've given you enough chances, and this time, I'm choosing me. I'm not going to keep making excuses for you, Paul. This marriage ended the moment you decided to betray me." She stood, walking slowly to the door, pausing for a moment to look back at him. "I don't know who you are anymore, but I know who I am, and I'm done." With that, she left, closing the door behind her, the finality of the decision settling over her like a quiet storm. The road ahead was uncertain, but Maggie felt a strange sense of peace. She had done what she needed to do. The rest was up to her. Maggie stood in front of the mirror, the reflections staring back at her both foreign and familiar. The woman who looked back at her had been through hell, but she had survived it. The weight of the divorce had not lifted completely, but in this moment, standing alone in her home, she knew one thing for sure. She was free. It wasn't a victory she had ever envisioned for herself, but it was a victory nonetheless. The legal proceedings had moved quickly. Divorce in many ways was a business transaction. There were papers to sign, assets to divide, and a future to plan for. Paul had accepted the terms without much fight. His initial attempts to win her back had been met with Maggie's unwavering resolve. And as much as he tried to appeal to her sense of pity, Maggie couldn't be swayed. She didn't feel sorry for him anymore. There were moments during the process when Maggie had second thoughts, when guilt crept in, or memories of better days tried to claw their way to the surface. She had loved Paul, and the life they had shared had been full of memories that couldn't be erased overnight. But she had learned something through this painful experience. Sometimes love wasn't enough. Sometimes love wasn't even the answer. Self-respect and peace of mind were, and she needed those now more than ever. It had been 2 weeks since the final papers were signed. Maggie had taken a week off work, using the time to regroup, to think about what was next. The house that once felt like a prison now felt like a blank slate, waiting to be filled with new possibilities. Her children, Rachel especially, had been her greatest source of support. Rachel had moved back in for a while, offering comfort and companionship while Maggie navigated the emotional aftermath. Maggie had also reconnected with a few old friends, women who had gone through their own struggles and emerged stronger for it. The conversations were healing in ways she hadn't expected. Even though Paul had taken his things from the house, there were still reminders of him. His cologne lingering on the pillow, a photo of their wedding day on the mantel. But these reminders didn't break her anymore. They were just pieces of a life that no longer belonged to her. Maggie had started to box up his things, slowly and deliberately, creating space for herself in the home that had once belonged to both of them. One evening, as she stood by the window, looking out at the fading light of dusk, Maggie felt a wave of calm wash over her. It was quiet, peaceful even. The noise of her past life, of the lies and betrayals, had faded away, leaving room for the woman she was becoming. She wasn't sure where life would take her from here, but she was no longer afraid to move forward. She wasn't defined by the marriage she had lost, but by the woman she was becoming. For the first time in months, Maggie felt alive. The weight of guilt, of wondering whether she had made the right choice, was gone. She had done what she needed to do for herself, and in that, she had reclaimed her life. Her phone buzzed. Rachel had sent a message, reminding her that they had a dinner date planned for the evening. Maggie smiled to herself as she typed back, "I'll be ready." She had come through the storm stronger than she had ever imagined. She had taken back control. And now she could finally start living again.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.